Okay, Layer's law number 3 relates to quotations. In particular, you want to hug your quotes. And what I mean by this is wrapping your quotes in context, first by setting up the quote so the reader knows what they're going to see, and then providing an explanation of the quote after you have given it. So you want context before your quote, and then you want an explanation after your quote. And the reason why I made this one of my laws is that students have a tendency just to throw quotes into a paper without any context or explanation. And I think they are assuming that the quote and its significance is self-evident, but they are not. All right. You, as the author, want to explain to the reader why this quote is significant, how it relates to the broader point that you're trying to make. And you also want to set up the quotation so the reader knows how to appreciate it when they see it. So that's why you want context before the quote and an explanation after it, hence the wrapping it in context and explanation, or hugging it, because there's something before and something after. And here's an example of an uncontextualized or unhugged quote. One of Weber's main concerns was rationalization. Quote, "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, the disenchantment of the world." Weber also argues. So here we have a statement, then a quote, and then we're just moving on from that quote. And unless you are really familiar with Weber's arguments, it would be hard for someone to know and to appreciate what this quote means and how this relates to rationalization in any meaningful way. The reality is that this idea of disenchantment of the world is one of Weber's biggest ideas, and one that has a lot of import into understanding the modern world. But if the reader is not overly familiar with Weber, they're not going to be able to appreciate this quote and its true significance. To do that, to put the reader in a position where they can really appreciate what's going on, we need to hug this quote. And so here's an example of what that would look like. So, Weber was concerned with rationality and how, as the world was becoming increasingly rationalized, we would come to live in a world stripped of all its magical and mystical elements. Weber talks about this in terms of a process of disenchantment. Here I'm kind of explaining the general context of rationality and Weber's general thoughts on it. And then I'm also setting up this quote and letting the reader know that when Weber talks about disenchantment, he's talking about the consequences of rationalization. Then I give the quote. "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, the disenchantment of the world." So I've set up this quote so the reader has a sense of what's coming down the pike, and they have a way to appreciate what the idea of disenchantment means. But now, to make sure the reader really understands what's going on here, I want to explain that quote to them. So I could say something like this. What Weber means by this is that when everything is rationally planned and organized, there'll be little room for unanticipated and spontaneous action and forms of thought. For example, religious experiences, moral beliefs, and magic and spirituality that lay outside the bounds of rationality. All this text in bold is that wrapping or hugging process where I'm providing context for the quote, then I'm giving the quote, and then I'm explaining it and its significance to the reader. This is something you really want to do in your papers, and it makes the quote and evidence that you're using from the meat racket or other readings that you're drawing from, it makes them much more powerful and much more significant and lets the reader really understand what you're trying to say and why it is significant. All right, the fourth law is that you want to explain to the reader what's going on in your paper. Don't take your statements as being self-evident. So just like we want to explain quotes, we also want to explain our thoughts to the reader and not treat them as being self-evident. There's another way of saying explanations are greater than a statement. And here's examples of what the form that statements take. X is illustrative of A, or Y is the consequence of B. These are statements, and they very may well be true and accurate, but just left on their own, they're not as powerful as they could be unless the reader happens to know a lot about whatever it is you're talking about. But that's not something we can assume. So that's why the obligation is on us to explain what is going on to the reader. And a simple way to know if you're explaining things and not just stating them is if you see the word because in your sentence. Everything after because is your explanation. And that's where the bulk of your points will come from in this paper, is the strength of how you're explaining these things, not just these simple statements. So explanations take the form of X is illustrative of A because, and then you outline your reasons. This means that, and again, you're kind of explaining what's going on here. Y is the consequence of B because, and again here, you offer your explanation for why in fact B is the result of Y, or whatever Y is doing. And if you've noticed, a common theme for at least most of the first layers laws we're looking at is getting people to explain themselves and getting more of their thoughts out on the page. In general, the issue that I run into the most with papers, and the issue that I see the most with papers, is not that students don't understand what's going on. It's just that a lot of their understanding remains trapped in their head and they don't get it down on paper. But it's imperative you get those thoughts down on paper, because you need to give the reader all the information they need in order to understand what's going on in the same way in which you understand it. And it can be really tempting, because if you don't understand this material really well, that you can take all this stuff for granted and you don't think you need to explain what's going on because to you it is self-evident. But remember, you are writing for an audience who you're going to assume has not taken this class, has not read the meat racket, and so can't appreciate just simple statements or just quotes that are thrown in at random. They need context and they need explanation so they can be on the same page as you and are able to be convinced by the argument that you're making.